The morning had started like all the others in recent years, silent, slow, and predictable. I had gotten up early, made coffee and watched through the window the same field where nothing changed. But sometimes the world decides to collapse when we least expect it. And that morning, the mere sound of the doorbell pierced me like lightning. I did not receive visits without warning. I didn't receive visitors, period. I walked to the door with cautious steps, already feeling my heart racing for no apparent reason. When I opened it, I had to blink several times to believe what I saw. The face in front of me was older, more rigid, but unmistakable. My son, Lucas, was there, standing as if the last 15 years did not exist. My breath failed, and for a moment I forgot who I was. He smiled, but it wasn't the smile I remembered. It was shorter, calculated, and his eyes seemed to try to skin me before I even said anything. My whole body trembled. I had imagined this reunion 1,000 times, but no version came close to the shock I felt when I saw it so real, so close and so distant at the same time. The first thing I did was touch his face, fearing it was a vision. He let him, but did not return the gesture. He just stood still, watching me as if studying my reaction. I identified something cold there, but my mind, stubborn, wanted to believe that it was just the embarrassment of the reunion. I wanted to believe in so many things at that moment. I invited him in, and he walked through the door naturally, as if he had never left. I felt a deep weight as I saw my home being invaded by memories that I had forced myself to bury. The smell of coffee filled the kitchen, but he seemed indifferent, almost impatient. Still, I forced a smile, because moms do that, even when they're shattered. We sat down at the table, but the silence between us was so thick that we could hardly breathe. I was looking for something to say, anything that wouldn't reveal my confusion. He, however, seemed comfortable with the discomfort, as if he had prepared himself for it. His eyes scanned the house as if evaluating an environment before closing a deal. Finally, he spoke. He asked how I was, how I had spent all these years, but the question sounded mechanical, almost obligatory. I answered, trying to keep my voice steady, but inside I felt like a lost child. I wanted to hug him, cry, ask for explanations. But he didn't give me any of that. When I mentioned the years of absence, he looked away and changed the subject immediately. He spoke of the long journey, of the fatigue, and asked to rest in the old room. There was something strange about his attitude, something that scratched my intuition, but I kept silent. It was still my hope speaking louder than my reason. As he climbed the stairs, I watched his steady, almost hurried steps. My heart vibrated with joy and fear at the same time. Just the fact of having it inside the house already seemed like a miracle, but also a warning. I didn't know if God had brought him back, or if it was just testing my strength. I closed the door slowly, took a deep breath and leaned against the wall. My hands were still shaking. Something told me that this return was not a gift, but a harbinger. And in that instant, for the first time, I felt that life was about to change, and not in the way I wanted. If this story has already hooked you from the beginning, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow the outcome with me. Here, each chapter reveals something new. Luca's presence in the house made the air change texture. It was as if each room had been rearranged without me touching anything. Silence, once my companion, now seemed to observe everything with suspicion. I walked to the kitchen trying to resume a routine that no longer existed. As I prepared something for us to eat, I heard slow footsteps coming down the stairs. Lucas appeared in the hallway looking at every object, every piece of furniture, every photograph. His eyes did not carry nostalgia, but a kind of calculation, as if evaluating the value of each thing. A sting of discomfort went through my chest. He commented on the house being well maintained, but the tone seemed skewed, as if there was a hidden criticism. I talked about the renovations I made and mentioned, unintentionally, approximate values. I noticed that this piqued his immediate interest. His gaze became more attentive, almost alive for the first time that day. We sat down at the table again, and this time he asked questions about my financial situation. She asked about my retirement, investments, the inheritance left by my husband. I tried to disguise my discomfort, but it was impossible not to notice that he didn't ask about me, but about what I had. When I mentioned that he still kept a considerable part of the inheritance, he put the cup down carefully, as if each gesture was being rehearsed. That gave me a chill. He was not a son interested in his mother's life. He was a man analyzing possibilities. But I wasn't ready to admit it. He stood up suddenly, saying he needed to show me something. He opened his backpack and pulled out a thick black briefcase, too organized for someone who had just reappeared. He placed it on the table with a precise, almost professional gesture. My stomach churned before I even knew what was there. Lucas explained that they were simple documents, which only needed my signature to resolve old pending issues. The words seemed light, but the way he pushed the briefcase towards me was stone-weighted. I tried to open it, but my hands trembled, and he quickly offered to help. Too much help. I asked him what it was about, and he answered with vague phrases, ready justifications. He spoke too fast, smiled too little, and looked at me as if he knew exactly how far I would resist. My heart was pounding, urging caution. Intuition whispered, something is wrong. I said I would read it calmly later, and I noticed the immediate discomfort on his face. He insisted, said it was better to solve it soon, that I didn't have to worry about anything. His urgency was a silent cry, and it wasn't the cry of a loving son. It was someone in a hurry, with plan, afraid. When he left to answer a call, I opened the folder discreetly. The words jumped out at me: transfer of assets, authorization of total administration, assignment of rights. My heart almost stopped. At that moment, I realized that my home was no longer safe. I realized that my own son had not come back for me, but for all that I could lose. The rest of the afternoon dragged by, as if every minute carried an unknown weight. I tried to convince myself that I was misinterpreting Lucas's behavior, but that tightness in my chest didn't leave me alone. As he walked through the house, I heard drawers opening, doors moving, calculated footsteps. Something inside me said that this was not curiosity, it was inspection. I sat in the armchair in the living room trying to distract myself, but my eyes always returned to the folder on the table. She seemed alive, pulsating, as if she wanted to warn me of something urgent. When Lucas returned to the room, I noticed that he was watching my movements with unusual attention, as if he were evaluating each reaction. It made me cringe. He asked again if I had read the papers. I replied that I needed time, but he insisted in a way that did not match the supposed tenderness of the reunion. The voice became firmer, almost hard. I felt my stomach turn as I realized that there was no love in that insistence, just haste. Dangerous haste. To relieve the tension, I suggested that he go rest for a while, and his gaze darkened for a moment. Still, he climbed the stairs slowly, casting one last glance at the briefcase. When I heard him close the bedroom door, I took a deep breath, but the air seemed too thick to fill my lungs. The house, my house, no longer belonged only to me. The afternoon light came through the window and illuminated the table with an uncomfortable glow. I got up and approached the briefcase again. I didn't have the courage to open it at that moment, but I felt I needed to act. Something terrible awaited me inside, and I could no longer pretend otherwise. Fear was mixed with the urgent need for answers. Then I heard my neighbor Diane call from the balcony. She rarely showed up unannounced, which only added to my nervousness. I opened the door and she looked at me with concern, saying that she had seen Lucas earlier and that something about him had made her uneasy. I tried to minimize it, but my voice faltered. Diane, insightful, noticed immediately. I invited her in and, as we talked about the briefcase and Lucas' strange attitude, I felt the weight I had been carrying diminish a little. Diane has always had an almost supernatural ability to perceive what no one sees. Her eyes squinted as she heard my story, and her attentive silence said it all. She felt danger, too. She asked me to calm down, but suggested that I not sign anything until I fully understood what was happening. I thanked him, but my mind was still in turmoil. I wanted to believe that my son had come back out of love, regret, longing. However, every detail pointed in the opposite direction. When Diane left, I closed the door slowly and stood leaning there, feeling the cold of the wood on my back. My heart was beating as if it was trying to escape my chest. Night was approaching, and with it the growing certainty that Lucas had not returned to meet his mother again. He had returned to something much darker. I went upstairs to my room trying to organize thoughts that seemed like loose pieces of a lifetime. I didn't have all the answers yet, but I already had the first clear sign. My instinct was right. Something was very wrong, and this was just the beginning. The next morning brought a strangely cold light into the house, as if the sun was afraid to enter. I walked down the stairs with light steps, trying not to wake Lucas, and almost jumped when I found Diane sitting on the porch waiting for me. His face carried the same concern as the night before, perhaps even greater. She entered unceremoniously when I asked, and closed the door behind her as if trying to prevent something dangerous from escaping. He said that he had not been able to sleep, thinking about the way Lucas had looked at me, and that he needed to talk to me urgently. I was grateful for the concern, but at the same time afraid of what she would say. I showed her the folder that bothered me so much. Diane opened it carefully, as if she were handling an explosive object. His eyes scrolled across the pages and his face immediately changed. She looked up at me as if confirming a terrible diagnosis. It wasn't my imagination, there was something deeply wrong there. She explained that they were not simple documents, as Lucas had said. They were complex legal forms, full of terms that transferred to him full financial control over my assets. My heart sank. It was as if the ground had been torn from under my feet. With each word from Diane, my hope diminished. We sat together at the table, and she held my hand firmly. He said I needed to seek professional help before it was too late. The suggestion immediately aroused emotional resistance in me. After all, we are talking about my son. But at the same time, I knew that denying reality could destroy me. As we talked, we heard heavy footsteps upstairs. The sound chilled me all over. Diane shook my hand before getting up and walking away discreetly, asking me to call her at any time. The door closed behind her, and I took a deep breath to try to look normal as Lucas came downstairs. He appeared in the kitchen a few seconds later, his gaze fixed on the table, exactly where the briefcase was. He asked if I had already signed. The coldness of the question hit me like a blow. I felt my fingers tremble over the cup, but I forced a smile and said I was still thinking. The change in his face was barely noticeable, but it didn't go unnoticed by me. It was as if a mask had moved, revealing a shadow underneath. He took a deep breath, as if he was controlling his own impatience, and said that time was short, that I needed to trust him. But the word trust has never sounded so empty. When he went out to sort things out, I closed all the doors and windows, as if that could protect my heart from the growing truth. I went back to the briefcase and looked at it as if I were looking at a sentence. I already knew, I needed professional help. Diane was right, it was time to look for the lawyer. As I prepared to leave, I felt a shiver down my spine. The clear, cutting sensation, impossible to ignore. The danger was already inside my house, and I could no longer pretend that I could not see. After Lucas left that morning, the house plunged into a heavy silence, unlike any I have ever experienced. It seemed that the walls had heard everything and now awaited the outcome, in suspense. I walked from room to room not sure what to look for, only feeling that there was something hidden somewhere. Something from the past that I had avoided facing for years, because it hurt more than I was willing to admit. But now, ignoring seemed far more dangerous than remembering. I went up to the room where I kept old boxes, full of papers, letters and memories that I never had the courage to throw away. As I dragged one of the boxes to the center of the room, I felt the weight not only physically, but emotionally. Inside was a life that I had preferred to leave dusty, because each memory carried a part of me. I opened the lid and began to rummage through yellowed envelopes, old bills, notes from my husband, until he found a folded letter with Lucas' name written on top. My heart raced as soon as I saw that firm handwriting, my husband's. I sat on the edge of the bed before my legs gave way, and took a deep breath to be able to open the paper. The first few lines hit me as a belated confession, something he never had the courage to tell me in life. It described a serious situation in which Lucas had used our data to try to open a line of credit, and how it almost cost us our home, years before our son disappeared. My husband had written that he had decided to hide the episode from me to protect my heart. She said she would talk to Lucas and solve everything between men, believing that he would change over time. But he ended the letter by saying that he feared he was creating a bigger problem for the future. That if something happened to him, I should be very careful with any document placed in front of me, especially if it came from the hands of our own son. The words scrambled before my eyes when I reached this passage. It was as if my husband was talking to me on the other side of the time, trying to reach me. I felt a wave of anger and sadness at the same time, because he had kept it, because I didn't know before, and for realizing that the threat I now faced was not new. It was an old shadow, just returning in another form. I folded the letter with trembling hands, but my heart was firmer than minutes ago. The illusion that Lucas's return was a miracle was beginning to crumble completely. Now I saw a pattern, a story that had been repeating itself, only more dangerous this time. It wasn't just a lost son trying to start over. He was a man who had learned, from a young age, to use his family as a tool. I stood up decisively, wiping the tears with the back of my hand. If my husband were alive, I knew he would tell me to stop being naive, that love was not synonymous with blindness, and that I should not sacrifice my dignity for guilt. The letter was not just a late warning, it was also permission to finally get up. I went downstairs with the folded letter in my pocket and a clear goal in mind. I needed someone who understood those documents better than I did, someone who could protect me legally. It was no longer enough to be suspicious, I needed to be sure, to have proof, to have support. Diane had already given the first push in the right direction. Now it was my turn to take the next step and look for a lawyer. Before leaving, I looked around the house as if I was saying goodbye to a place that would never be the same again. I wasn't sure what awaited me, but I knew very well what I would risk if I stayed still. I grabbed my purse, my keys, and the damn briefcase that now seemed even heavier. I opened the door, feeling the cold wind hit my face like a call to reality. And for the first time in a long time, I walked not as a victim, but as someone going to fight. The city looked different that day, even though I knew they were the same streets as always. Perhaps it was I who was no longer the same woman who had walked there so many times. Every step to the lawyer's office seemed like a test of courage. My fingers squeezed the handle of the bag so hard that it hurt. But still, I didn't stop. David Harper's office was on an inconspicuous corner in an old brick building. The metal plate on the door reflected the light of that morning's faint sun, almost blinding me for a second. I took a deep breath before entering, feeling my heart racing as if I were about to commit an unforgivable daring. The receptionist greeted me kindly, and her quiet voice helped me regain some air. I sat in the waiting room, trying to organize the words I would use. When David called me in, I felt my legs hesitate, but his calm smile gave me some reassurance. He was a middle-aged man, with the watchful eyes of someone who is used to hearing serious problems. I sat down in front of him, put the briefcase on the table and, before anything else, confessed that I was afraid. Fear of imagining too much and also fear of being right. He nodded, saying that this was the most common fear that came here. I explained about Lucas's return, about the 15 years of absence, about the hurried way he had brought the documents. I told her about Diane, my husband's letter, and the weight that all that had on my chest. As I spoke, David didn't interrupt me, just jotted down a few points and watched my face respectfully. I saw no mercy in his eyes, but I saw something better: seriousness. It was as if he was saying, in silence, that it mattered. When he finally opened the briefcase, the environment seemed to change. He flipped through sheet by sheet, stopping in terms that to me were just noise, but to him said a lot. As he read, his expression became more rigid, like that of someone who confirms a diagnosis he did not want to give. After a few minutes, he closed the papers carefully and took a deep breath. I already knew that the next words would not be easy to hear. David looked me in the eye and said, quite clearly, that the documents were a scam. If I signed, Lucas would have absolute control over my house, my boarding house, and my husband's entire inheritance. I would cease, in practice, to have any financial autonomy, becoming totally dependent on my own child. My stomach knotted so hard that I had to hold on to the edge of the chair so I wouldn't flinch. It was worse than I had imagined in my darkest thoughts. He continued to explain, calmly, that he had seen similar cases. Children, grandchildren, close relatives using trust and guilt as weapons to take everything from vulnerable elderly people. The words vulnerable and elderly hurt my pride, but I knew they were true. For years I had lived as a shadow of myself, afraid of loneliness and guilt. Now I saw how easy it made me. David then asked if I would authorize a deeper investigation into the history of Lucas.eu. I almost answered no, in an automatic reflex of a mother trying to protect her son. But my husband's letter burned in my pocket, reminding me of the danger of continuing to protect those who only hurt me. I took a deep breath, discreetly wiped away a tear and said yes. Yes, I wanted the truth, no matter how cruel it was. He assured me that I was not alone and that, from that moment on, everything would be documented. He said that I should avoid signing anything, and that, if possible, I would maintain some degree of normality with Lucas until we had more evidence. It was a dangerous but necessary game, and I would have to play the role of the naive mother for a while longer. I left the office feeling heavier and, at the same time, more protected. It was as if I had taken my first official step in the war for my own life. When I put my feet back on the sidewalk, the city no longer seemed so threatening. Holding the briefcase to my chest, I felt that I was no longer just a frightened lady. I was a woman who had been deceived, yes, but who now chose to react. As I walked back home, a thought repeated in my mind like a mantra. If Lucas wanted to play, he didn't imagine that the mother he left behind wasn't the same one he found now. When I got home, Lucas' car was already in front of the garage. A shiver ran through my spine as I realized that while I was seeking protection, he was probably planning the next move. I took a deep breath before entering, trying to put on the mask of a distracted mother again. The smell of ready-to-eat food came from the kitchen, and for a moment I had the impression of seeing the teenage son I remembered. But the feeling ended as soon as I heard his voice. He asked where I had gone, with a tone too light to be natural. I replied that I had gone to solve things in the center, avoiding details, and I noticed his eyes examining me. It was as if he was trying to measure how much I was still manipulable. I sat at the table, trying not to show the nervousness that still burned in my chest. I needed to be careful, for myself. During dinner, Lucas returned to talking about the documents as if they were a simple formality. She said she just wanted to help me with bureaucratic things, which I wouldn't understand on my own. I forced a smile, listened to everything and just nodded, without promising anything. Inside, David's words echoed, louder and louder. Coup. Total control. Loss of everything. When I carefully mentioned that perhaps a lawyer had better take a look, Luke's face changed. It was quick, but impossible to ignore. His eyes hardened, his jaw locked for an instant. He regained control quickly, saying it was exaggeration and unnecessary mistrust. But that microsecond of irritation told me more than any speech. His mask was starting to slip. After dinner, he began to walk around the house with an impatient air. He asked if I didn't trust him, if I didn't miss having someone to take care of everything. I knew it was an emotional trap, a direct appeal to my loneliness. And for a moment, I admit, I almost gave in to the blame. But then I remembered David's letter and words. At one point, he got too close, invading my space in a way he had never done before. He looked me straight in the eye and said, quietly, that he was trying to fix the past. That I should collaborate if I wanted things to be different this time. There was something ominous behind that phrase, a veiled promise of consequences. My skin crawled all over. I told him that I still needed time, that my head was no longer as fast as before. I tried to speak calmly, but my voice betrayed a tremor that I could not control. He sighed deeply, turned his back and went to the living room, where he started to fiddle with my document cabinet. I watched from afar, feeling the fear grow with each open drawer. He was not looking for souvenirs. I was looking for proof, access, power. When night fell, and the house was plunged into darkness, the atmosphere became even heavier. I could hear the sound of his footsteps moving from room to room, like an invader in broad daylight. I locked my bedroom door from the inside, something I had never done before. I lay in bed, but sleep didn't come. The only thing that came were thoughts about what he would be able to do if I didn't give in. There, in the dark, I understood that it was no longer just a sad story of reunion. It was a dangerous game in which I was the weakest piece, at least in his eyes. But a thought began to take shape in the midst of fear. I was no longer the scared woman I had years ago. I had information, I had allies, I had the truth approaching. And whether Lucas wanted to or not, his mask wouldn't stay up for long. If you are feeling the tension increase along with me, enjoy and subscribe. That way you don't miss any detail of this turning point that is just beginning. The next day, I woke up with the feeling of having slept with one eye open. My head was throbbing, but my decision was firmer. I couldn't just wait for everything to explode inside my house. He needed to act quietly, like someone moving in enemy territory. And, in a way, it was exactly that. I made the coffee as usual, trying to look the same as before. Lucas came downstairs, sleepy, but with the same calculated look as always. I talked about banal things, asked about the weather, commented on the city's market. He answered little, more concerned with checking his cell phone and looking at the briefcase in the kitchen. I felt every muscle tense, but I kept a smile. As soon as he left saying that he needed to solve some business, I called Diane. She arrived quickly, as if she was ready for my call. I told her what had happened the night before, and I saw the silent anger rise in her eyes. Diane wasn't afraid to call a spade a spade. She said it was abuse, manipulation, and real danger. His sincerity cut me off, but it also strengthened me. I showed her my husband's letter, which I still carried with me as protection. As she read, I saw her face harden, confirming that I wasn't exaggerating. She agreed that looking for David had been the best thing I could have done, and he suggested that we keep in constant contact until everything is cleared up. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't totally alone. Later, I received a call from David himself. He told me that he had already begun to investigate Lucas's recent past. He spoke of financial records, loan attempts, open debts. And he mentioned, carefully, that there were possibly dangerous people involved collecting this money. Suddenly, everything made even more sense. When I hung up, my heart was tight, but with a new clarity. Lucas had not returned because he missed him. He had come back because he was cornered, and I was the only way out he could see. The house, the inheritance, my retirement, everything was a bargaining chip for him. And if I didn't give in, he would lose much more than I did. David and I decided that it would be best to act as if I didn't know anything yet. He needed time to gather concrete evidence, something that could be used legally. In the meantime, I would have to continue playing the role of the confused, cautious, but not openly suspicious mother. It was a risky strategy, but the only one that would give us a chance to turn the tide. I never imagined that, at the age of 70, I would enter a war of this kind. When Lucas came back that afternoon, I was already on the couch, watching television as if nothing had happened. He greeted me with a quick kiss on the head, a rehearsed gesture, without warmth. He asked if I had thought of that and, once again, I said that I still needed time. This time, I noticed that he made no effort to hide his irritation. The atmosphere between us became thicker, almost palpable. While he was taking a shower, I went to the kitchen and pretended to occupy myself with pots and dishes. In fact, my ear was attentive, my whole body on alert. I knew he was suspicious of something, just as I knew time was running out. But now I also had a weapon, information and support. It wasn't much, but it was infinitely more than I had when he knocked on my door. That night, I lay in bed with a restless heart, but different from the previous days. Fear was still there, but it was no longer the only feeling. There was also a discreet determination. Almost knew in MIM.eu would no longer be just the guilty mother, willing to do anything to get her child back. If Lucas wanted my destruction, he would have to face me entirely, not the broken version he imagined. The next few days seemed like a long narrow corridor, where every step echoed on the walls. Lucas was different, more restless, more angry, as if something was pressing him on all sides. He walked around the house with his cell phone glued to his hand, whispering in calls that always ended with muffled expletives. I didn't understand all the words, but I understood the tone. He was afraid, and that, in a way, made it even more dangerous. I noticed that he began to control my routine more strictly. He asked where I went, who I spoke to, how long I would be away. If I took a few more minutes on the street, when I came back he greeted me with crossed questions. It was as if my every move was a threat to the plane he was trying to keep upright, and I had to pretend I didn't notice anything. One day, he touched my bag without any shame. He said he was looking for my medicines, but I knew that was a lie. I caught a glimpse of his eyes rummaging through my papers, trying to find something that wasn't there. I had begun to hide important documents in a place that only Diane and I knew, and his frustration was evident when he found nothing. That afternoon, he locked himself in his room and spent hours on the phone. From the hallway, I could hear snippets of the conversation, loose words that stuck in my mind. Deadline, guarantee, she will sign, calm down. There was a mixture of pleading and irritation in his voice, like someone trying to hold a bomb about to explode. It was the first time I felt, clearly, that he was afraid of people other than me. I called Diane as soon as I could, speaking quietly, as if the walls had ears. She listened to me in silence and then said that I shouldn't be alone with him for long periods. She suggested that I call her more often, that she maintain the appearance of a busy house. It was a way of reminding him that I wasn't as isolated as he would have liked. And I knew that, at that point, any extra shadow could save me. The next day, David called me with even heavier news. He said that he had confirmed the existence of high debts in Lucas' name, some linked to dangerous people. He said that there were records of threats, aggressive charges, almost extortion. My hand sweated as I held the phone, imagining the kind of people who could knock on my door, and understanding, finally, why Luke seemed so desperate. After that call, I watched his every move even more carefully. I noticed that he began to separate some valuables from the house, as if he were taking inventory. He commented, in a casual tone, on how much the house could be worth if it were put up for sale quickly. I responded with empty phrases, but inside I felt a mixture of nausea and revolt. It was my life being measured as an asset in a spreadsheet. In the evening, he tried once again to press me about the documents. This time, he didn't just use sweet words, he used guilt. He said that I had abandoned him when he needed it most, and that now was the chance to fix everything. The tears came up in his eyes, but, unlike before, they didn't move me. They sounded to me like part of a rehearsed script. When I went to sleep, I locked the bedroom door again. I lay there looking at the ceiling, listening to every noise in the house, every footstep, every door opening. The feeling of siege was almost physical, as if I was surrounded on all sides. For him, for the debts, for the past, for the guilt and shame of having taken so long to see. But at the same time, something inside me was starting to harden for good. That night, I understood that this game could not go on for long. Lucas was getting more dangerous as he realized he was losing control. And I, on the other hand, was ceasing to be the terrified woman he had hoped to find. The siege was closing, yes, but not just around me. It began, silently, to close itself around him as well. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise, overcome by a restlessness that did not allow rest. I went to the kitchen and prepared coffee more out of habit than hunger. Silence still reigned when I heard the discreet noise of the front door opening. I went to the window, my heart racing, and saw him rushing in, with a backpack bigger than usual. Something about him seemed even more tense, as if time was running out. He avoided looking me in the eye as he passed through the kitchen. He just said, "Good morning," when he was run over and went straight to the bedroom. Shortly after, I heard the sound of zippers opening, drawers being emptied, things being packed in a hurry. It was like watching, from a distance, someone dismantling a makeshift camp. But this camp was my own home. I tried to act naturally, but my hands trembled even to hold the cup. When he finally got off, I noticed that he was carrying a thick envelope, in addition to the folder with the documents. He said he needed to talk to me seriously, in a tone that left no room for escape. I sat at the table, feeling the weight of the situation settling in like a dark cloud. I already knew that something big was about to happen. Lucas explained, with forced sincerity, that his life wasn't easy. He confessed that he had debts, that dangerous people were pressuring him, that he needed to get out of town as soon as possible. But instead of regret, what I saw was calculation. He told me that I was the only person who could help him start over. And this time, he didn't use the word help, he used sacrifice. He placed the documents again in front of me, as if it were the last round of a game. He said that if I signed everything there, he would be able to pay off his debts, sell the house quickly and sort out his life. He said that later he would take care of me, that I could live in another smaller but safe place. The phrase crossed me with a mixture of dread and indignation. It was as if I was a weight that he had to manage after using me. When, once again, I hesitated to pick up the pen, his countenance changed completely. The sweetness disappeared for good, giving way to a hard, almost cruel look. He leaned forward, rested his elbows on the table and spoke softly, as if threatening without raising his voice. He said that if I didn't help, much worse people could come and collect this debt directly here, and that no one wanted to see a fragile lady in the middle of a situation like this. For years, I had repeated to myself and to others that I was fragile, delicate, vulnerable. But at that moment, I realized that he was using precisely this image to arrest me, to put me against the wall, to make me believe that I had no choice. And that, more than anything, awakened something I thought I had missed. I stared into his eyes for a few seconds, in silence. Then, with a calmness that surprised me, I said that I would not sign anything without a review by a lawyer. He laughed, a dry laugh, humorless, and said that I was not understanding the size of the problem. I replied that maybe he was the one who wasn't understanding the size of the mother he had in front of him. It was the first time I didn't lower my head in the face of his pressure. I saw the shock pass through Lucas's face, followed by a suppressed fury. He stood up abruptly, walking through the kitchen like a caged animal. He grumbled things about time, about deadlines, about dangerous people who weren't going to wait much longer. He said that if everything went wrong, it would be my fault. I listened, feeling every word like a blow, but I sat firm. When he went back up to the room, I heard the sound of suitcases being closed for good. My heart raced, but not from despair, but from alertness. I understood that he was preparing to run away as soon as he got what he wanted, with me or without me. I picked up the phone with trembling but determined hands, and called David and Diane. Lucas had an escape plan. It was time we had a plan to stop him. That late afternoon, the light came in through the window with a strange hue, almost reddish, as if even the sky were restless. Lucas went down the stairs with 2 firm steps, carrying the briefcase again and that tired expression of someone who made a decision. I immediately felt that something had changed, as if he had crossed an invisible line within himself. There was no more attempt at emotional seduction, there was no rehearsed affection, there was only a cold urgency in his eyes. He called me to the kitchen table and pulled a chair tightly, inviting me to sit down. I obeyed, more to observe closely than to submissive. He put the folder on the table, opened it quickly and took out the main pages, with the signature spaces already marked. He pushed the papers towards me, along with a silver pen. This time, there was no disguise of kindness in his voice. "We've reached the point where you have to decide," he said, looking directly at me. He slammed his hand on the table, making the pen jump and my body shudder. He said that I was not understanding, that this was no longer a choice, but a necessity. That if I didn't sign, there would be no going back for either of us. I felt fear rise up my throat like a sore knot, but I forced myself to swallow. He began to speak louder, words full of accusation, throwing all the blame of the past on me. He said that if his life had gone wrong, it was because he grew up in a weak house, with a weak mother. He called my love self-indulgence, my concern disguised control. Every sentence was a stab, but also a flash into who he really was. When I tried to get up, he held my arm too tightly to be a gesture of son. It didn't just hurt my skin, it hurt all the memories I had of him as a little boy, hugging my neck. Seeing that same boy now squeezing me like someone grabbing prey was almost unbearable. However, along with the pain, there was also a different, more lucid kind of anger. I no longer saw him as a victim of his circumstances, but as a conscious author of his choices. He placed the pen in my hand, guiding it to the signature space. His voice lowered in tone, but became more threatening, like a serpent whispering. He spoke of men who could come there, of violence, of irreversible consequences. He said he was still trying to save me the worst, but that I was making everything difficult. He wanted me to believe that the coup was some kind of desperate favor. My heart was beating so loudly that I could almost hear it echoing in the kitchen. For a moment, I thought about giving in, just to end that nightmare. But as I looked at the papers, I saw more than clauses and numbers. I saw the complete erasure of my life. I saw my husband being betrayed even after he died. I saw the effort of a lifetime becoming a cipher. And I realized that if I signed, I wouldn't be saving anyone, only prolonging Lucas's chasm. I took a deep breath, took my hand off the pen and looked him in the eyes. I said I wouldn't sign, that I wouldn't be part of that plan, that I wouldn't give him what was left of me. For a second, he froze, as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard. Then something broke inside him, and I saw hatred appear without any disguise. It was the son I fathered, but it was no longer the son I knew. He got up so fast that the chair fell backwards, making a dry noise against the floor. He paced back and forth, running his hands through his hair, muttering disconnected things. He said that I was signing my own sentence, that I had no idea what would come next. He threatened to leave and never return, leaving me to the consequences. At that moment, for the first time, I did want him to leave. But he came back to me, in a last effort, and rested both hands on the table, leaning over me. He said that this was the last chance, that either I signed that night, or we would all pay too high a price. The tension-laden breath, the hard gaze, the weight of the words, everything around seemed darker. And even so, a part of me began to calm down, curiously, because I knew that, in silence, I had already started to set my own trap. Hours before that confrontation, I already felt that something big was approaching. After the call with David, we quietly agreed on a simple but risky plan. He instructed me to try to make Lucas talk as much as possible about the coup, about the debts, about his intentions. He said that if I could record everything, it would be enough evidence to act more harshly. I trembled at the thought of it, but I agreed. Diane came to my house that afternoon under the guise of bringing a cake. While Lucas was locked in his room, the two of us talked quickly in the kitchen, with whispered voices. I showed the small tape recorder on my cell phone and explained what David had suggested. She looked at me with a mixture of fear and admiration, saying that I was being much stronger than I thought. Before leaving, he shook my hands and promised to be ready. When Lucas called me into the kitchen that night, I had already slid my phone under the tablecloth. I started the recording myself discreetly, activating the speakerphone so that the sound would be clearer. And as he poured out accusations, veiled threats, and confessions of debts, every word was recorded in silence. On the outside, I looked like just a scared lady being pressured by her own son. Inside, I was memorizing every sentence, as evidence that could save my life. In one of the most tense moments, I excused myself to go to the bathroom, feeling that he was almost at the limit. I entered the room and, with trembling hands, called Diane. I asked her to call David and, if possible, call the police immediately. I explained that Lucas was coercing me to sign and that I had managed to record a good part of the conversation. She didn't ask questions, she just said, "Hang in there, we're coming." I went back to the kitchen trying to keep my face neutral, as if nothing had happened. Lucas was even more agitated, walking in circles, muttering curses between his teeth. When he saw me, he pointed to the chair with a dry gesture, ordering me to sit down. I obeyed, not out of submission, but because I needed that theater to continue a little longer. Every minute was precious to those who were on the way. He resumed the speech, now more direct, clearly talking about selling the house, disappearing from the city, clearing the name. He said, out loud, that I would not be able to contest it later, because everything would be signed and registered. Every sentence of his confirmed what David already suspected and went far beyond my imagination as a mother. For a moment, I thought of the boy who one day held my hand to cross the street, and I wondered at what exact moment he had lost himself for good. At one point, he grabbed my chin with his hand and forced it to look at the papers. The anger I felt in that gesture was so intense that it burned my desire to cry. I said, in a low but firm voice, that I would not sign anything that night. He squeezed it even harder, threatening to make me understand by force. It was then that I heard, in the distance, the sound that would change everything: sirens approaching. Lucas paused for a second, confused, trying to identify where the noise was coming from. He said it was probably some incident in the neighborhood and tried to get back on the pressure, but I already knew it was no coincidence. He walked to the window, lifted the curtain slightly, and turned pale. Blue and red lights tinged the silent street in front of my house. The next few minutes passed too quickly and, at the same time, in slow motion. Loud knocks on the door echoed through the house, followed by firm voices announcing the presence of the police. Lucas gave me a look of pure hatred and despair, as if he had realized that the tables had turned. He still tried to collect the papers, erase traces, but it was too late. I opened the door with trembling hands, but with a strange sense of relief. Diane was outside, next to the police and David, who held his own briefcase in his hands. The agents entered, identified Lucas and asked him to move away from me immediately. David explained, with the firm calm of someone who knows what he is doing, about the recording, the documents, the debts. I stood there, in the middle of it all, feeling my heart beat in a rhythm that mixed fear and liberation. The house, which looked like my prison, suddenly became the stage of truth. When I saw the police officers approaching Lucas to restrain him, something inside me broke and pulled itself together at the same time. This was not what I had imagined when I dreamed, years ago, of my son's return. But it was the only possible ending for that version of him that had returned. He was not a repentant heir, he was not a son seeking forgiveness. He was a man willing to destroy me, and that night I finally refused to let him succeed. The days between the night of the arrest and the hearing seemed like a kind of limbo. The house was quieter than ever, but it wasn't the silence of loneliness, but of the hangover. Each corner still carried the memory of Lucas' voice, the threats, the pressure, but at the same time, there was a new space, as if the air had been returned to my lungs. For the first time in a long time, I breathed unapologetically. David came to visit me a few times, bringing updates on the process. He explained that the recording, the documents and the history of debts formed a very serious picture. He spoke carefully, always looking me in the eyes, as someone who respects the pain of others. Diane, on the other hand, took on the role of emotional bodyguard, not letting me sink into guilt. Between the two of them, I felt like I was in a new kind of family, one that protected me instead of sucking me in. On the day of the hearing, my stomach had been churned since dawn. I put on a simple but neat outfit, and Diane insisted that I tie my hair up carefully. She said that I needed to see myself as I really was now, a woman who had faced her own son and was still standing. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't just see wrinkles and tiredness. I saw someone who had survived the worst of betrayals. The courtroom was cold, with light walls and hard wooden benches. As I entered, I felt all the sounds mingle in a distant hum. I saw people I didn't know, piled up papers, curious looks. But nothing struck me as much as the sight of Luke, sitting on the other side, handcuffed. He avoided my gaze, but I felt the turmoil hovering around him. When the judge entered, the atmosphere changed tone, as if someone had pressed an invisible button. Everyone got up, everyone sat down, and the formality of it all made me even smaller in the seat. David leaned over to me and whispered that I didn't need to be afraid, that the truth was on our side. I nodded, but my hands were still cold, pressed together. It was still my son sitting there, and that was the cruelest part of it all. The prosecution began by presenting the facts, the debts, the previous scams, the attempted fraud using my name. I heard my own name repeated countless times, as if I were a character in a story and not the narrator herself. The recording was mentioned, the main excerpts were transcribed and read aloud. Every time I heard Lucas' voice pressing against me, a piece of me broke again. But, curiously, another piece was rebuilding itself firmer. The moment came when they called me to testify. I got up slowly, feeling every bone, every memory, every year lived weigh on my steps. When I sat down in front of the microphone, I thought my voice would fail. But when I looked ahead and saw the judge, the lawyers, and even some people in town, something lined up inside me. It was no longer just Teresa, the frail lady. I was the witness of my own history. I told him how he had disappeared, how I waited, how I suffered, how I blamed myself for years. I spoke of the reunion, the portfolio, the pressure, the guilt used as a weapon. I described the tightness in the arm, the tone of the threats, the fear of losing everything. As I spoke, I didn't notice, but my voice became firmer. It was as if, with each sentence, I tore away a little of the shame I carried alone. At one point, Lucas's lawyer tried to insinuate that I might be confused. He spoke of my age, of my emotional health, as if that diminished what I experienced. David countered firmly, remembering that the facts were not only in my memory, but recorded in audio. When the judge asked me if I feared my son, I took a deep breath before answering. I said I was no longer afraid. I feared the woman I would become if I remained silent. At the end of the testimony, I returned to my seat with wobbly legs, but with my spine more upright than when I arrived. I felt a few different looks on me, no longer the silent feather of before. And for a brief moment, I saw Luke looking directly at me, with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Maybe he had never imagined that I would get this far. But there, in that icy courtroom, was the first time I was sure I would not go back to who I was before. The closing arguments played out like a carefully guided storm. The prosecution reconstructed the timeline, showing Lucas every step with a coldness I could never have. They talked about previous fraud attempts, the signature that almost took our house years ago, my husband's letter. They cited the pattern of behavior, the recurrence of lies, the calculated use of family ties. It was like seeing our entire history being dissected in public. The defense tried to soften it, saying that Lucas was desperate, that the debts had led him to a moral collapse. They spoke of missed opportunities, of a difficult childhood, of psychological traumas. I heard all that with a knot in my chest, because part of those pains I knew closely. But, as much as the explanation seemed human, it did not erase the fact that he almost destroyed my life. Desperation does not justify making one's own mother a target. When the judge retired to deliberate, the room was plunged into tense silence. I felt my breath held up, as if I was waiting for a verdict on myself. Diane held my hand tightly, and David kept his gaze straight ahead, as if he had seen many scenes like that. For me, however, everything was new, heavy, surreal. It was the kind of moment I would only imagine in stories, never in my own. When the judge returned, everyone stood up again. He read the verdict in a neutral tone, but every word seemed to streak fire in the air. Guilty of attempted embezzlement, coercion, document fraud, sentenced to prison, with the possibility of agreement only if he cooperated with investigations of other debts and scams. The words echoed in my head, as if they did not refer to the boy I cradled in my arms. Lucas reacted with a mixture of incredulity and revolt. He raised his voice, tried to say that everything was exaggerated, that he just wanted to start over. But no one else seemed willing to believe his version. The officers approached, asking him to calm down, while handcuffing him again. I watched everything from afar, feeling a pain I couldn't name. For a moment, our eyes met. There was more hatred than anything else in his eyes, as if I was responsible for his downfall. Maybe, in his mind, I really was. Perhaps it would be easier to blame myself than to admit the choices you have made over the years. I, for my part, couldn't feel revenge, just a different grief. When the hearing was over, people began to disperse, commenting in low voices. Some gave me sympathetic looks, others curious, others judgmental. I didn't have the energy to decipher each one of them. Diane hugged me right there in the hallway of the courthouse, and I finally let a few tears fall. Not of guilt, but of exhaustion. David approached, saying that the worst was over from a legal point of view. He explained that my assets were protected, that the documents would now serve as evidence against Lucas, not against me. I shook my head, not yet knowing what to do with this possible responsibility, but a part of me liked the idea of turning pain into alertness. As I left the courtroom, I felt the air of the street hit my face as if it were another climate, another city. The sky was clear, but I felt like someone who had just been through a hurricane. I looked at the building for a moment and knew I was leaving something behind in there. Not just a lawsuit, not just a verdict. I also left the version of me that accepted to suffer in silence. On the way back home, the world outside seemed to go on normally, cars passing by, people coming and going, dogs barking in the distance. And I, sitting in the car seat next to Diane, understood something simple and painful. I had lost, in a way, the son I once dreamed of having back. But in the midst of this loss, I had found another person I didn't expect to meet again, myself. And as bittersweet as it was, that discovery was worth protecting going forward. Returning home after the hearing was like stepping into a familiar place with completely new eyes. The walls remained the same, the floor creaked in the same places, and there was still a faint smell of coffee impregnated in the furniture. But I walked differently. It was as if my steps finally occupied the space I had avoided for years. I was no longer hiding inside my own home. Over the next few days, I calmly reorganized the house, almost like an emotional cleansing ritual. I threw away old papers, changed curtains, removed objects that reminded me of times when I felt small. I found strength in simple details: a new jar on the table, a plant that bloomed for the first time, the morning light coming in without asking permission. I felt that the house breathed with me, as if we were rebuilding together. A silent partnership between walls and memory. Diane started to come more often, always bringing cake, flowers, or funny stories from the neighborhood. I realized that, for a long time, I confused independence with isolation. I thought that in order to be strong, I had to face everything alone, and I almost lost my life for that. Now, I allowed good people to come in and occupy spaces that I had previously guarded as trenches. Loneliness is no longer armor and is back to being just silence. David also remained present, advising on documents and assuring me that nothing else would threaten me. He proposed that I formally register some legal limits, to avoid any unwanted approach from Lucas in the future. I signed everything with steady hands, feeling that each document was a reinforcement of my newfound autonomy. I never thought that a lawyer would become someone so important in my life, not only because of the laws, but because of the way he tried to respect me, with patience, with humanity. At one point, I received a letter from the penitentiary in the mail. Lucas's name on the envelope almost made my chest collapse again. It took me long minutes to decide whether to open or not, but in the end, I did. He apologized, or something that sounded like excuses, but he spoke more about his own suffering than mine. He said he needed me, that I was the only family he had left. I folded the letter carefully, but without tears. The pain was there, of course, as it always was, but now it no longer commanded me. I knew that answering that letter would put me back in the cycle that almost destroyed me. He also knew that forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation, sometimes it just means letting go. I put the letter away in a drawer that I rarely open, and went on with my day. I started participating in a community group that helps seniors recognize signs of financial abuse. At first, I was like a listener, shy, withdrawn, but over time I realized that my story had weight, and it had use. Speaking did not weaken me. On the contrary, I freed myself a little more with each encounter. It was as if I was using my scars as a compass for other people. One day, a woman hugged me at the end of the meeting, saying that my account prevented her from signing documents suspicious of her own nephew. I cried that night, but not in pain. I cried because, after so long stuck in a cycle of loss, I finally felt that something good was born from it. I wasn't just a victim, I was now a voice. Time went by and, little by little, I went back to walking in the city with less fear. People smiled at me, some with compassion, some with respect. I realized that I was seen as someone strong, and not because I achieved something great, but because I survived what seemed impossible. For the first time, I believed in it too. It wasn't just looks, it was true. Today, when I close the windows at dusk, I feel a peace that I thought I had lost forever. My home is, again, mine. My life, again, mine. I still carry marks, of course, no story like mine ends without scars. But now, when I look in the mirror, I see not the fragile woman that Lucas tried to manipulate, but the woman who stood up, resisted and won. Now I want to know from you, what would you do in Teresa's place? Would you have the courage to face your own child? Would he have forgiven? Or do you think she did exactly what needed to be done? Comment below. I really want to read your opinion. And if this story moved you, share it so that more people know stories like Teresa's. Thank you for following until the end.